911.
Some deaths are so horrifying they sound completely unreal. A man whose body literally dissolved from radiation. A Disneyland ride that turned into a crushing death trap. Workers torn apart by pressure frozen alive inside a restaurant freezer, and nobles drowned in human waste beneath a collapsing floor. These aren't scenes from horror movies, they actually happened. Tonight we uncover 7 of the most brutal, bizarre, and disturbing deaths in human history, and the tiny mistakes that triggered unimaginable nightmares. Alan Catterall, The Oven of Horror, 2010. Just days before Christmas in 2010, 54-year-old Alan Catterall walked into work expecting another routine shift at a kayak manufacturing factory in Cheshire, England. A respected supervisor with more than a decade of experience, Alan had done this job countless times before. But on that cold December morning, one small oversight would turn an ordinary industrial oven into a nightmare no one could forget. The massive machine used to mold plastic kayaks could reach temperatures hotter than 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Alan stepped inside to clean it, while the factory floor roared with the sound of machinery. Nearby, his co-worker, who was also preparing to marry Alan's daughter, believed the oven was empty. Without realizing Alan was still inside, he restarted the system. The heavy door sealed shut automatically. At first, no one noticed anything wrong. Then workers saw dark smoke rising from the oven. Panic spread across the factory as alarms echoed through the building. When the door was finally opened, the scene inside shocked everyone. Investigators later discovered the company had ignored multiple safety warnings about the oven's automatic locking system. Even worse, employees reportedly lacked proper training for cleaning procedures. The tragedy sparked lawsuits, criminal charges, and major changes to industrial safety regulations. But for many, one terrifying question still remains. How could a modern factory allow something like this to happen? King Henry VI, the Erfurt latrine disaster, 1184. In the summer of 1184, some of the most powerful nobles in the Holy Roman Empire gathered inside a large stone building near the Cathedral of Erfurt, Germany. The meeting was meant to settle a dangerous political dispute between rival lords, and young King Henry VI himself arrived to mediate the conflict. Tensions were high, but no one imagined the real danger wasn't political at all. Beneath the crowded hall sat a massive medieval waste pit, hidden under rotting wooden floors that had been weakening for years. As bishops, knights, and noblemen packed into the upper level, the ancient beams beneath them began to groan under the weight. Then, without warning, the floor suddenly collapsed. Dozens of people crashed through the second story, smashed through the level below, and disappeared into the darkness beneath the building. Screams echoed through the hall as debris, broken wood, and bodies plunged into a giant cesspool filled with human waste. Panic spread instantly, but there was nowhere to escape. Many victims were badly injured from the fall, while others became trapped under heavy rubble. According to historical accounts, somewhere between 60 and 100 people lost their lives in one of the strangest disasters of the Middle Ages. Amazingly, King Henry VI survived only because he had been seated on a stone ledge near a window moments before the collapse. What began as a royal political meeting ended as a horrifying catastrophe that medieval Europe would never forget, a disaster so bizarre it almost sounds impossible to believe. Nguyen Lê, frozen inside the Arby's freezer, 2023. On the morning of May 11th, 2023, 63-year-old Nguyen Lê arrived at an Arby's restaurant in Louisiana for what should have been a completely ordinary workday. Known as a hardworking and dedicated manager, she had recently transferred to the location alongside her son. Like every opening shift, her routine included checking inventory inside the restaurant's industrial walk-in freezer. But behind that heavy steel door was a deadly problem employees had reportedly known about for months. The freezer latch had been malfunctioning for a long time. According to later reports, workers were even using a screwdriver to force the door open whenever it jammed. That morning, when de Witt stepped inside, the door suddenly locked behind her. The temperature inside hovered around -10 degrees Fahrenheit. She had no phone, no emergency alarm nearby, and no way to call for help. As the busy kitchen filled with the sound of fryers' machines and customers, no one heard her desperate attempts to escape. Hours later, her son arrived for his evening shift and made a horrifying discovery inside the freezer. Investigators later revealed that the dangerous door issue had allegedly been ignored despite repeated warnings. The tragedy quickly sparked outrage across the country, with many asking how such a basic safety failure could still exist in a modern workplace. What happened to Trina Lel became more than just a workplace accident. It became a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying dangers are hiding inside the places we see every day. Deborah Gale Stone, The Last Ride at Disneyland. 1974. Disneyland has always been called the happiest place on Earth, a world filled with music lights and childhood memories. But in the summer of 1974, one attraction inside the famous park became the center of a tragedy so disturbing that many guests who witnessed it never forgot what they heard that night. 18-year-old Deborah Gale Stone had only recently started working at Disneyland as a hostess for a brand new attraction called America Sings, a rotating theater filled with singing, animatronic animals celebrating American history. The show looked harmless from the outside. Guests sat inside rotating sections that slowly moved around a circular stage every few minutes, while robotic characters performed songs. Deborah's job was simple guide visitors in and out between each performance. But on the night of July 8th, during one of the final shows before closing time, something went terribly wrong. As the massive theater walls began rotating for the next audience, Deborah accidentally stepped too close to a narrow gap between a moving wall and the stationary stage. Within seconds, she became trapped inside the machinery. Nearby guests reportedly heard a sudden scream, but many assumed it was simply part of the attraction's sound effects. By the time employees realized there was an emergency, it was already too late. The horrifying accident shocked Disneyland visitors across the country and forced Disney to temporarily shut down the ride while investigators searched for answers. Safety systems were later redesigned, but Deborah Gale Stone's story remains one of the darkest incidents ever connected to Disneyland. A chilling reminder that even places built for happiness can hide unimaginable danger. The Byford Dolphin disaster, 1983. Working hundreds of feet beneath the ocean surface is already one of the most dangerous jobs on Earth. In November 1983, aboard the offshore oil rig Byford Dolphin in the North Sea, a routine diving operation suddenly turned into one of the most shocking industrial accidents ever recorded. The crew that day consisted of experienced saturation divers workers, specially trained to survive extreme underwater pressure for weeks at a time inside sealed chambers connected to a diving bell. Everything appeared normal as the divers completed their shift and prepared to return to the pressurized living chambers aboard the rig. But during the transfer process, something went catastrophically wrong. Before the chamber had been fully secured, a sudden pressure failure triggered an explosive decompression event, powerful enough to tear through the system in an instant. The sound echoed across the platform as steel doors burst open and chaos erupted throughout the rig. Workers nearby barely had time to understand what had happened. The accident claimed multiple lives within seconds, and left even seasoned investigators horrified by the damage caused by the extreme pressure change. One crew member standing closest to the chamber suffered the worst effects of the blast, while others inside the system had no chance to react. The tragedy shocked the offshore drilling industry worldwide and forced major reforms in commercial diving safety procedures. Decades later, the Byford Dolphin disaster is still remembered as one of the most terrifying reminders of what can happen when humans push technology and the human body to its absolute limits beneath the sea. Johan de Witt, the cannibal riot of 1672. Politics today can be brutal, but in the Netherlands during the 1600s, political failure could cost far more than a career. In 1672, a year the Dutch would later call the disaster year, the country was invaded by powerful enemies from multiple sides. Fear spread through the streets as the once mighty Dutch Republic seemed close to collapse. At the center of the growing panic stood Johan de Witt, one of the most influential political leaders in the nation. For years, he had guided the Republic through wealth and peace, but now angry citizens wanted someone to blame. As military losses mounted, public opinion turned violently against Johan and his brother, Cornelis de Witt. Rumors, accusations, and political hatred exploded across the country. Cornelis was arrested and accused of conspiracy, and when Johan visited him at a prison in The Hague, an enormous crowd gathered outside. What began as public outrage quickly spiraled into complete chaos. Guards disappeared, tempers erupted, and the mob dragged the brothers into the streets as terrified witnesses watched the violence unfold. Historical accounts describe one of the darkest moments in Dutch history. The brothers were attacked by the furious crowd, their bodies publicly mutilated as the riot grew even more disturbing. Some reports from the time claimed parts of the remains were taken by members of the mob in an act that shocked Europe for generations. Whether every detail is true or exaggerated by history, one thing is certain. The deaths of Johan and Cornelis de Witt became a terrifying symbol of what can happen when fear politics and mass hysteria collide. Hisashi Uchi, the most radioactive man in history, 1999. On September 30th, 1999, workers at a nuclear facility in Tokaimura, Japan, began what seemed like an ordinary day inside a uranium processing plant. Among them was 35-year-old technician Hisashi Uchi, an experienced employee helping prepare nuclear fuel for an experimental reactor. But within seconds, a single mistake triggered a blinding blue flash inside the facility, a sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing nuclear accidents ever recorded. The sudden reaction exposed Uchi to an unimaginable level of radiation far beyond what the human body was ever meant to survive. At first, he was still conscious and able to speak with doctors, but his condition rapidly deteriorated. As days passed, medical teams realized the radiation had caused devastating damage deep inside his body at the cellular level. Specialists from across Japan desperately attempted experimental treatments in hopes of saving him, while the world watched in shock as the case became international news. For nearly 3 months, doctors fought to keep him alive inside a heavily monitored hospital room. The accident raised terrifying questions about nuclear safety and whether modern technology had crossed a dangerous line. Investigations later revealed serious failures in training and safety procedures at the plant, sparking outrage throughout Japan. Even decades later, the story of Hisashi Uchi remains one of the most haunting reminders of how one small human error can unleash consequences almost impossible to comprehend. Cameron Doyle, the wedding photographer of destruction. 2017. Cameron Doyle built her career capturing love stories, Elegant weddings, smiling couples, golden sunsets from the outside, she looked like the perfect photographer, trusted with life's happiest memories. But behind the camera, Cameron had a darker talent. She didn't just photograph people, she studied them. Their insecurities, their secrets, the tiny fractures hiding beneath perfect relationships. And once she found those cracks, she knew exactly how to break them apart. 8 months before Valentine's Day, 2017, Jake Johnson hired Cameron to photograph his engagement celebration. He believed he was building a future with the woman he loved and their unborn child on the way. But sometime after the event, mysterious photos and rumors began surfacing online. Carefully edited images and manipulative lies convinced Jake's fiancée that he had been unfaithful. The relationship collapsed almost overnight. Jake lost his family, his future, and eventually himself, sinking into grief and isolation, while Cameron quietly moved on to her next client as if nothing had happened. But Cameron had one ritual she never missed. Every Valentine's Day, she traveled alone to a secluded cliffside rose garden on the California coast to take photos with a single red rose at sunset. On February 14th, 2017, Jake waited for her there among the quiet pathways overlooking the ocean. When he finally stepped out and revealed who he was, Cameron showed no guilt for the destruction she had caused. What followed became a tragic confrontation near the edge of the cliffs, where anger, heartbreak, and years of buried pain spiraled out of control in only a few terrifying seconds. Renee Mallister, the Camp Wildwood nightmare. By the age of 31, Renee Mallister had mastered the art of appearing untouchable. Online, she looked glamorous, confident, and successful, the kind of person who turned every memory into a perfect photo. But hidden beneath that polished image was a cruel past, buried deep inside the ruins of Camp Wildwood, an abandoned summer camp, where 20 years earlier, Renee and her friends had transformed one quiet boy's childhood into a living nightmare. For Jordan Whitaker, the memories never faded. At just 12 years old, he became the target of relentless humiliation at the camp. Locked in closets, mocked in front of other kids, and pushed so far into despair that he once wrote a suicide note he never threw away. While Renee moved on with her life, Jordan stayed trapped in the shadows of those memories, eventually working as a caretaker on the same deserted property where his innocence had been destroyed. Every broken cabin and rusted playground became a reminder of who he used to be before the bullying changed him forever. Then, in a twist that felt almost unreal, Renee announced online that she was returning to Camp Wildwood alone for a nostalgic photo shoot. On the night she arrived, Jordan stepped out from the darkness of the abandoned dining hall, holding the faded note she had unknowingly inspired decades earlier. But instead of remorse, Renee laughed off the past as childish fun. What followed became a terrifying chase through collapsing buildings and unstable rope courses, hanging high above the forest floor, where years of buried trauma, anger, and fear finally exploded into a confrontation neither of them would survive unchanged. Blake Thornton, The Mountain Road Revenge. Blake Thornton spent most of his life believing money could erase consequences. At 28, the wealthy socialite moved through the world untouched by the chaos he created. Reckless parties, speeding tickets, drunk driving incidents, all quietly cleaned up before they could damage his reputation. But everything changed the night his speeding BMW struck 6-year-old Emma Lel in a dark crosswalk, destroying a little girl's future in a matter of seconds. For Emma's mother, Trina Lel, the courtroom became a second nightmare. She sat only feet away as expensive lawyers twisted. The story softened the facts and helped Blake walk away with barely a punishment. While he returned to luxury parties and late-night drinking, Trina returned home to an empty bedroom filled with toys her daughter would never touch again. Grief slowly hardened into obsession, and over the following months, she began studying Blake's routines with terrifying patience. Every Tuesday night, Blake followed the same pattern: heavy drinking at a local tavern before driving home along a winding mountain highway he treated like his personal racetrack. On one cold evening, Trina waited silently in the shadows of the parking lot, while Blake laughed with friends inside. By the time he climbed behind the wheel, he had no idea something was terribly wrong. Minutes later, speeding through the darkness at mile marker 23, Blake pressed the brake pedal and felt nothing. The mountain curve rushed toward him as panic finally replaced arrogance, and in one horrifying instant, the man who had escaped justice discovered that consequences had been waiting for him all along. Sabrina. The Penthouse Fall 2019. Sabrina knew exactly how to make herself irresistible. At 29, the glamorous real estate agent moved through luxury hotels, rooftop parties, and wealthy social circles with effortless charm. But behind the designer dresses and perfect online photos was a dangerous pattern. Sabrina didn't just flirt with married men, she targeted them. To her, broken marriages were trophies, and the emotional wreckage left behind was simply proof of her power. Kelly Anderson learned that truth in the worst possible way. For 12 years, she had built a quiet life with her husband David and their twin daughters, believing their family was stable. Then, as Sabrina entered their lives, and everything began to collapse. Secret hotel receipts, hidden gifts, unexplained trips. Each discovery pushed Kelly deeper into heartbreak. But the most painful moments came at night, listening to her daughters cry and ask why their father suddenly cared more about someone else than his own family. Months later, Kelly uncovered one of Sabrina's favorite meeting places, a luxury penthouse suite high above downtown Miami. On December 8, 2019, she sent a message from David's phone, knowing Sabrina would arrive expecting romance and another easy victory. Instead, she walked into a confrontation fueled by betrayal, humiliation, and years of buried anger. As the argument escalated near the balcony overlooking the glowing city below, Sabrina realized too late that the woman standing in front of her was no longer asking for apologies or explanations. In a matter of seconds, a glamorous fantasy turned into a nightmare that would end high above the Miami skyline. Jordan Whittaker, the surgeon's final operation. At St. Mary's Hospital, Dr. Jordan Whittaker was treated like a legend. Wealthy patients trusted him, administrators protected him, and younger doctors feared challenging him. Behind the polished reputation, however, rumors followed him everywhere. Unnecessary surgeries, reckless shortcuts, and mistakes quietly hidden behind paperwork and money. Jordan believed his status made him untouchable, and for years no one seemed capable of proving otherwise. For Gina Anderson, everything became personal after her father entered Jordan's operating room with what should have been a manageable condition and never came back out alive. Gina worked as a surgical nurse in the same hospital, and she had spent years watching Jordan manipulate cases and intimidate staff into silence. While the hospital called her father's death an unfortunate complication, Gina became convinced something far darker had happened behind those operating room doors. Then fate handed her an opportunity. Jordan secretly scheduled a private late-night procedure for himself, hoping to avoid gossip about his health problems. In the nearly empty hospital, surrounded by quiet hallways and dim surgical lights, he believed he still controlled everything. But as the anesthesia began taking effect, alarms suddenly echoed through the operating suite. Doctors rushed in as panic spread across the room, and for the first time in his career, the man who controlled life and death found himself trapped on the other side of the table. Molly Anderson. The Financial Predator, 2017. Molly Anderson looked like someone people were supposed to trust. At 32, the successful financial advisor spoke with calm confidence, dressed elegantly, and specialized in helping elderly clients manage their retirement savings. But behind the polished image was a hidden scheme that allegedly targeted some of society's most vulnerable people. Families slowly began discovering missing money, forged signatures, and emptied accounts connected to seniors suffering from dementia victims, who often couldn't even remember what had been taken from them. For Camille Doyle, the nightmare became personal after her grandmother, Margaret, suddenly faced unpaid nursing home bills despite decades of careful savings. Margaret, once an independent retired librarian, was left frightened and confused, terrified she might lose the only safe place she had left. As Camille dug through financial records and old transactions, one name kept appearing over and over again: Molly Anderson. The search eventually led to a remote mountain cabin in Colorado, a quiet place Molly reportedly used whenever legal trouble started getting too close. Alex Flores, the man who refused to pay, 2013. Alex Flores lived a simple life on the outskirts of Monterrey, Mexico. At 32, he worked long hours as a school bus mechanic, supporting his wife and 2 young children, while staying far away from trouble. Friends described him as quiet, dependable, and hard-working, the kind of man who believed that if you kept your head down and did the right thing, life would eventually reward you. But in neighborhoods controlled by violent gangs, even ordinary people can become targets overnight. The trouble began when local criminals demanded weekly protection money from businesses and workers in the area. Most people paid out of fear, but Alex refused. Worse still, he quietly passed information to police about the gang's movements, believing someone had to stand up before things became even more dangerous. Soon, the warnings started. Strangers lingered near his street. Neighbors noticed unfamiliar cars watching the block. People began mentioning his children by name. Still, Alex kept going to work every morning, hoping the threats would fade away.